Thank you, Kevin. Turn the floor back over to you, Doggett. Sorry.
Thank you. Thank you so much. As you all know, the session begins the second Wednesday in January. Lots going on before then. Right now, a lot of people are meeting about bills. We're meeting with interest groups and other lobbyists and community groups and so forth. You may be interested in next week on the 15th, Thursday, there will be a meeting of the money committees. So that's a really important kind of mid-year status, but it also will have the governor's proposed budget. So that'll be interested to see how he takes forth his priorities in the budget and how we keep forward moving with that. But that's very interesting. That will be, you'll be able to watch that cyber, and anybody interested in that, please help yourself. Before that, on Monday, for those of you who are interested in kind of following JLARC, which is the Joint Legislative Audit and Review Committee, which meets once a month. They will be meeting on Monday. Now, for those of you who don't know about it, it is kind of the watchdog for the state government. Make sure that how taxpayers' money is being spent efficiently and that our state agencies are being well managed and programs are being carried out in a careful manner. There will be a JLARC meeting on Monday. Again, you'll be able to watch that or pull up those things afterward online under JLARC. Next Monday, there are a number of reports that will come through, one on the CSB Behavioral Health Services, the state, a kind of status review of the SOQ funding, the cost of the dual enrollment program, a kind of follow up to the VEC. You know, we had a lot of controversy and so forth, a lot of complaints and so forth about that, and they've been trying to get that straight. And there'll be a follow-up with JLARC on that, oversight on the Virginia retirement system, and then oversight of the economic development incentives. So those are all very interesting areas. If you're interested in any of them and don't have time to watch it or pull it up afterwards, but you all can always go online and see JLARC on the website. So then we'll have that, then we'll have the money committees on Thursday, and we will have the session beginning in second Wednesday in January. Personally, I'll have some things that have been brought to me by constituents. And one thing, I always try to put in some bills that relate to the JLARC recommendations, because I always think they are good government. And this year I'm putting in a number, about 3 or 4 pieces of bills that relate to affordable housing. And we all know that affordable housing is an issue here in Richmond and also around the city and the Commonwealth. And so I'm excited, worked with a number of stakeholders on those pieces, and so excited to see how we might move forward with those. One other thing that I'm putting in is a bill that will hopefully help people who want to be foster adoptive parents, to make it easier for them, some of the bureaucracy and so forth that they need to go through. One other thing, more recently, I think some of you have probably heard about Beth Macy, who's has done a whole lot of work on the opioid epidemic. She started back in the mid 2015, and it was the same time I was able to get one of the first pieces of legislation that had to do with safe reporting and so forth. So that was kind of at the beginning. Beth Macy has come around, and she's written a book. You've probably read about it in the paper or so forth. It's called Raising Lazarus. But she's talking about how we've not done a good job of kind of stemming the supporting harm reduction in the opioid, and that so how many people are dying of suicide and so forth, and dying of overdose. So there's she's done a lot of work, talked with people in Commonwealth, but also around the country, who are having success in moving people from addiction to recovery. And one of the first steps is that she's come up with is that getting law enforcement officials trained in harm reduction. For instance, like being able to carry Narcan and use it, because a lot of people have fearful of it and so forth. But anyway, that I'm exploring something in that, because it is such a crucial issue for us right now. Those are a few of the things that I'm touching on. Be delighted to answer any questions, but also if any of you want to have any questions for me, please feel free to call me at 804-986-6852. Now that's my cell phone. And then of course you can always get me at delegate.carr@betsycarr.org. I look forward to talking to you, answering your questions, being as helpful as I can. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Delegate. And if folks do have questions, we are still in the portion of the meeting where we have to be a little bit cognizant of Zoom bombers. So we do have folks muted, but if you would like to be unmuted, just raise your hand and we'll do that, or drop your question in the chat. And we'll also drop some of that contact information for Delegate Carr in the chat as well.
Thank you for having me with you.
And Delegate, I do believe, oh, I'm sorry, Catherine. Looks like you have your hand raised. Let me see if we can unmute you. I think that should be allowed. There you go.
Thank you. Let's please read Cindy Wilford's comment. Thank you to Betsy for always doing a great job. I absolutely echo that. You are always so accessible and well-researched on the matters at hand and what your constituents are, having issues with. So thank you for coming to spend some of your evening with us. And Sven has added your contact information into the chat.
Beautiful. Thank you. Look forward to staying in touch. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Delegate. We will move right into the next agenda item, which I believe is probably why most people have tuned in tonight. And it's certainly, I would say, incredibly important for our city at the moment. We have 3 zoning rewrites that are being studied. So there's one on accessory dwelling units, one on short-term rentals, and one on parking minimums. And at this point, I will turn it over to Kevin Vonk and Brian Mercer from the Planning Department. Thank you so much.
Good evening. Thank you very much. Brian, if you're able to share your screen, do you want to bring up the slide deck?
Yes, let me get that.
And Sven, if you can put into the chat while that's getting loaded, the upcoming meetings and where people can find more information. Thank you.
Absolutely.
Great. Good evening. My name is Kevin J. Vonk. I'm the Director for Planning and Development Review. With me is Brian Mercer, who's a planner in our Office of Equitable Development. We're going to tag team this and really provide a high-level overview of what's being discussed, what's being proposed, what are the next steps in the process. So we'll just go through a few things and as time permits, be able to answer a few questions as best we can today, but then also invite you to participate in 2 upcoming engagement sessions that we'll be discussing shortly. All right. So 3 zoning changes, the overview. These were spurred on by one council resolution to eliminate parking space minimums, and 2 planning commission resolutions for permitting accessory dwelling units and revising short-term rental regulations. These were all passed within the span of the last year and a half. And the reason that we're working on them together is because we believe as you change one, there may be impacts to the other. As we move forward and start to propose legislation, they will all be independent papers, independent ordinances that will be considered and voted upon separately. But in the interest of time and having a really robust discussion, we've taken the 3 together for our engagement purposes. And the timeline, we started earlier this summer with some initial outreach, just some general informational sessions about the changes, really kind of describing what each of these involved. a variety of different methods of outreach, from in-person meetings to meetings like this, also telephone town hall, online survey. We took that information and have moved forward over the last few months with small focus group discussions, really trying to get diverse panels to discuss and sometimes debate, potential alternatives or proposals for each of these changes. We've summarized the results, and that moved into where we're at now in phase 3, drafting some concepts based on the results of the initial outreach, the focus groups, research that we've done in-house. We are putting forth, I'll say, a starting point for conversations in terms of a staff recommendation for proposals for shaping the ordinances that will move forward. And so we're at right now is discussing through some engagement again, which we'll talk about some meetings upcoming, to see how ultimately we should look at crafting those papers for introduction, which then we intend to do most likely pushing back into early 2023. All right, Brian, do you want to take the first one? Great.
Absolutely. Yeah, so again, my name is Brian Mercer. I'm a planner with the Department of Planning and Development Review. I've been with the city for over 5.5 years, and a lot of that time, or about 5 of the years, I was in the zoning office, and I recently moved into a new role of implementing Richmond 300. So I'm using my zoning experience in the city of Richmond and knowledge and really helping to apply these changes. And I've been in the city for 10 years. I've lived in the FAN for 7 years and the museum district now for 3 years. So these zoning changes are very familiar with me from both working in the zoning office and also just living my daily life here. So these are very important to the city and all of our neighbors as well. So the first one we want to talk about today, and we had a meeting yesterday. It was an hour and a half. So a lot of this information is on the website, which I'll have here at the end. I have the full presentation on the website as well. So just these quick slides are not everything that's involved. So after this meeting, I'd encourage you to look at that full presentation. And also we have a video of that hour and a half meeting yesterday. So I went into a lot more detail on each change here, but today I really just want to give a brief overview due to time. So the first one, as Kevin mentioned, through a city council resolution, was to eliminate parking space minimums. And throughout this process, we've really heard the concern that when you hear eliminate parking space minimums, you just automatically think eliminate parking spaces. And so our goal here is to say that it's not, we're going to prohibit any new parking spaces, or we're going to actively get rid of parking spaces. This is just something in the zoning ordinance that the planning department would not dictate how many parking spaces each use would use in the city. We've had decades of incremental changes that I go into more in the full presentation. But so for now, our recommendation is to eliminate the parking space requirements from the zoning ordinance. And also in the presentation, it shows of how the zoning parking requirements have changed over time. But this is kind of what it looks like right now in the zoning ordinance, but it's really complicated because there's also different zoning districts where the parking requirement may not be exactly what's in this chart, or it may be a district where no parking is required for commercial uses. So our recommendation, and this is off-street parking requirements, and I know a lot of the concerns we heard were about on-street parking, and people are parking too close to the intersection, and they're having to like stick their nose out and things like that. And so there's a lot of other ways that we can help manage that. And that's why some of our other initiatives that we really want to pursue are expanding the transit system and bicycle and pedestrian infrastructure. We know now we have the west to east pulse route, but right now GRTC just got funded to do a north to south study as well. So that's something, if we can really expand our transit system. But also we're seeing a bunch of bicycle lanes popping up throughout the city. So really encouraging that, and the pedestrian infrastructure. So it's really more about moving people over vehicles is one of the goals of this zoning change. And looking at promote shared parking. Looking at maybe uses where maybe during the weekends, they're not used for that parking area. So maybe you can share it with a use nearby. So not every use on a property has to have parking on that property. Maybe a block away, you could use shared parking lots throughout the city. But also, obviously, the second district is very well aware of the fan parking permit, these residential parking permit programs that we've had in place, and potentially expanding them or really revising them, looking how we can make them more beneficial. Because one of the concerns we did hear was about on-street parking overflowing into, when you have commercial, especially here along Main Street or Broad, you have that overflow of parking on the residential nearby streets. So looking at how we can improve that. Then also looking at curbside time limits periodically, looking at, and these are things we can work with through the Department of Public Works. So our high level recommendation is to remove the minimum from the zoning ordinance, let businesses, residential units, and I provided a slide. We heard concerns that developers they're going to get greedy and they're not going to provide any parking, but we've done a lot of research showing that these large scale developments provide more than enough or more than what's required, oftentimes 3 times as much as what would be required. So again, I would encourage you to look at the presentation for more information about that. And then the second
Brian,
one,
I'm
yep.
just going to jump in for a second. I'm just going to take the question in the chat just as it comes along. So as far as specifics to the neighborhood, if you look at, a lot of the second district, there's a number of different zoning districts. This would apply citywide. So in some of the residential areas that are mostly zoned either R5 or R6, it would eliminate minimum requirements for providing off-street spaces in those. Some of the mixed use districts, there's some TOD, there's some B5, it would eliminate requirements for those. And instead, as Brian mentioned, it would allow the developer or the owner of the property to decide how many parking spaces to provide. And I think, as we mentioned, some of the research showing that the larger developments tend to oversupply the parking. And so a goal would be to help out some of these smaller developments in terms of, not having to provide that off-street space. Allows them, one, to save money by not having to do that, but also to use the space more efficiently in terms of some smaller lots. Also, in terms of implementing other things that would complement this, there's a lot of the fan that's in a parking permit district. There's also a lot of the fan museum district that does not have parking permits. And so we'd want to look at ways to balance that out to allow for the most efficient use of on-street resources, especially for residents who live there.
If I can just interject at this moment, appreciate this conversation. And I feel like I'm glad that these items are grouped together because they have so much crossover. But at the same time, we could spend hours and hours and hours on any one of these, which is, I think, the challenge. And I know we want to get through a lot tonight. So I guess one question I would have, which I've heard a lot from constituents, would you consider, can we consider, a phased approach would be one thing, trial, let's test it out in this type of zoning before trying to implement it all across the city. That would be one question. And then I brought this up in the meeting yesterday, but yes, shared parking is amazing, but how can we be sure that that's actually going to be implemented? Because our office has had a hard time making those connections when they've been attempted. So do we feel the city can really help implement shared parking effectively? Thanks.
Yeah,
Sure.
I guess as far as the phased approach, and in my other presentation, it talks about just the changes over time. This has really been decades and decades of changes to the parking requirement. We look at areas like Carytown, West Brooklyn Park Boulevard, say, okay, maybe the parking requirement shouldn't be as strict there. And then we've even created zoning districts like downtown in the B4 and the TOD1 district, where we say, okay, no parking is required except for dwelling uses, hotels and motels. So this is really, and we've gotten that question a lot, how this shouldn't be a blanket across the whole city, but just looking at it, decades and decades, it changes over time that we've tried to do to reduce the parking, but it's still very complex and onerous with grandfathered parking. So I guess that's my answer to that. So and a lot of other cities that have eliminated parking spaces, they say that they've done also like decades of incremental changes, and then it just gets to the point where it's like it just makes sense to do this. So that's, I guess, my answer to that. And I don't know if you had a follow-up, or if Kevin, you wanted to tackle the shared parking aspect.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, we'll provide a recommendation through this process, and really the Plan Commission will make a recommendation to council of how they would like to do it, whether they take all the districts at once or want to have certain zoning districts, have this applied to. But I think based on the feedback we've heard so far, our research supported just starting wholesale. And as for shared, I think it is important to look at, tools that can be provided in terms of educational tools, or whether it's maybe a draft template from the city to help private owners negotiate agreements to share that parking, right? A lot of times right now, shared parking agreements, in order to meet the minimum requirements, have to be reviewed by our city attorney's office, which can be cumbersome and time consuming. But if we can provide some guidance and show some best practices of how to make it simple to negotiate those agreements between two parties, whether it's two homeowners or two businesses, we want to be able to share and provide opportunities that, hey, if you have a parking lot or parking space that's not being used all the time, why not try and potentially monetize that and use it and share it with another business or a resident that could use it in the off hours. All right, why don't we jump to ADUs?
Yeah,
Okay.
and Kevin, forgive me, I'm sorry, but I think Cindy had a follow-up question in the chat regarding commitments that may have been made with the approval of Richmond 300 with respect to individual neighborhoods being able to request exceptions. And I believe, Cindy, this relates to the parking requirements element, and I'm happy to unmute you as well if you'd like to further clarify that question. But Kevin, if you don't mind addressing that as well.
Sure. So I think in terms of, maybe discussed either like a phased approach or neighborhood by neighborhood. Right now, the parking requirements are tied to uses in specific zoning districts. So if we made changes to specific zoning districts, like let's say for a neighborhood that's zoned R6, it's going to impact all R6 neighborhoods across the city. If you wanted to look at it from a neighborhood to neighborhood approach without regard to the actual zoning district, we'd need to create another layer, I'll say, of zoning that would have it be an overlay and apply that way. So I think two ways to look at it in terms of, specifically in Richmond 300. One of the things that it talks about is adjusting for parking, but those would be the two ways to tackle it, I guess, from a regulatory perspective.
Yeah, and another issue that we found with doing it by neighborhood, as you see, like on our civic group webpage, the neighborhood civic association can pretty much draw the boundaries that they want, and there's a lot of times it's overlapping and things like that. So when we do it by neighborhood, sometimes the boundaries aren't as defined as we need them to be in order to enforce something like this.
Thank you.
All right, no other questions there. So the next zoning change we're looking at is to permit accessory dwelling units throughout the city. So one of the main things, or one of the big things we heard in Richmond 300 process was these accessory dwelling units. So they are a dwelling unit. So per definition, it has to have a place for eating, sleeping, and sanitation. So it has to have a full bath with a shower, and then just maybe like a little kitchenette and just a place to sleep. So we heard a lot of these ADUs now, or pretty much every new one will require a special use permit. So throughout the Richmond 300 process, we heard that we want to allow these more by right, but just a matter of where do we allow them by right, any other regulations. And a lot of times we think of these accessory dwelling units here in the top left. It's your detached structure in the backyard and you want to convert it to an ADU. But there's several other different kind of options you see here. It can be an addition, it could be a second floor, it could be even a basement. So you may not even see it from the exterior of the building that there's an ADU there. Or you could build it above the garage or a garage conversion. So I really wanted to include this slide just to show that I know a lot of us think of this top left one, but we had to look at all these other different types of ADUs and what regulations to put in place to allow these more by right. So one of the things that we really wanted to look at was what would truly be an accessory use, and not just building another single family building on another single family lot. So what is something that would be accessory and allowed by right or something that would not be accessory and would require special approval? So our recommendation is to permit one accessory dwelling unit by right on the same property as a single family dwelling. So it could be a single family detached or attached dwelling in all zoning districts that permit single family dwelling. So if you see to the map to the right here, these are all the zoning districts that allow for single family dwelling. So if you're in one of these districts, which you can see a lot of the second district is, you would, and if you have a single family dwelling, you can have one ADU. So this wouldn't apply to two families or even three or more units, multifamily. We thought that the best route to go was just for that single family, because we wanted to allow each property to have one additional unit. So once you start to get having a duplex and then adding another unit, okay, that starts to be 3 units on a property. So we just thought that the best route to go at this point is to allow that additional unit on every single family property. And another one of our recommendation was, as that image that I showed before, it could be either internal, attached, or detached to the single family dwelling. And going back to the accessory aspect of it, we thought that having it 1/3 of the floor area of the main single family dwelling, or 500 square feet, whichever is greater. So that really depends on the size of the existing house. So if you have a house that's only 1,000 square feet, 1/3 may not be enough for an ADU. So that's why we pushed it up to 500 square feet if your 1/3 falls under that. But then keeping that 1/3, we really think is making it accessory. And then we would just have whether it's an addition or a detached structure, it would have to meet the underlying zoning requirements in regards to setbacks, height, lot coverage, things like that. So if it's a detached structure, the height limit can be 20 feet. But if it's attached to the main dwelling, then it would just fall to the underlying zoning district, which is typically 35 feet in these zoning districts. And then lot coverage, typically in the R6, it's 55%. So we're just saying you can have this ADU by right if you meet all the other zoning requirements here. And I think that's all I had for ADUs at this time. And again, I go into more detail, but just trying to condense it down. These are our recommendations. I think we have a question.
And I want to afford an opportunity if folks have questions specific to ADUs. And then I think Martha had a question that kind of related back to parking requirements. So if folks have questions on the ADU section of the presentation, now would be a great sign. If you want to raise your hand, if you want to be unmuted, or if you want to drop that in the chat. And while we wait for a moment, to Martha's question that I think related back to the parking minimum, doing away with parking minimums, would Plan Development Review recommend a demolition review process for the city to protect against developers demolishing historic built environment as costs for that development become lower with a lack of parking requirements?
Sure, I can take that one. So we do have demolition review right now for properties that fall in our city old and historic districts. We do not for those that fall without. There has been some discussion about potentially adding demolition review to the design overlays. Currently, there's one west of the boulevard in the museum district. I believe we've received some for the fan and are reviewing those right now. So that could be a potential possibility. I will say we are in early 23 starting on a historic updating our historic inventory and resources. And one of the things we may look at and has been recommended in Richmond 300 is a demolition ordinance to review. I will say that is separate from these particular recommendations, but would need to be something either initiated through council or planning commission resolution to specifically do a demolition ordinance that applied throughout the city, or to perhaps structures of a particular age. And we would review that. And I think that will be also part of the discussions as we move forward with rewriting the zoning ordinance, which we'll also be working on next year.
Great, thanks. And Martha, if you have any follow-up on that, feel free to just drop that in the chat as well. And then any other follow-up questions relating to the ADU portion? And I did also drop in the chat what I believe to be, and Kevin and Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, the full presentation as was given at the first meeting yesterday.
Yes, that looks right.
Great. And I can confirm, having both Catherine and I participated, they go way into depth. So if you want to dive more into all three of those, that's a great opportunity to do so.
Well, let's move on to short-term rentals if there are no more questions at this moment.
Okay, perfect. All right, so then the last zoning change that we're pursuing at this time is to revise the short-term rental regulations. Probably all well aware, we had that first round of short-term rental regulations in 2019, 2020. But then obviously COVID happened, and we just had we have a few years under our belt now, and we're looking at ways to revise the existing short-term rental regulations, because we're not getting the compliance that we had hoped for at the time, whether it was the outside consulting firm that was helping us or just getting people to apply online. So our goal for this one was really just to see what's working, what people like, and what changes need to be made here. So right now, the regulation says that it has to be your primary residence. So you have to show that you live there, it's your primary residence. I know there's the number out there, 185 days, but it's really, you have to provide documentation showing that it's your primary residence. So if it's your primary residence, you can do it as like an accessory use. You can either rent out a room or your entire house. So with our recommendations here, but if it's not your primary residence, then it wasn't allowed, but people were still doing it. So that's why we heard from both sides that we wanted to retain the primary residency requirement. But then we also heard Airbnb hosts who say that they own one or two homes. It's not their primary residence, but they take really good care of it and things like that. So one of our recommendations, and again, I know Kevin probably mentioned this in the beginning, but these are just our draft recommendations. These are far from what's actually going to go before council. So this is just what we're proposing to hear feedback from. So our proposal is to keep that primary residency requirement, and you can do it as an accessory use. But if it's not your primary residence in a residential zone, then it could be permitted, but it can't be located within a certain distance of another non-primary residence short-term rental. So we haven't determined exactly what the distance is. We're kind of looking at a high level. Is this something that we want to look into doing, or if not, then that's fine. But we envision the larger or the lower density districts, the distance requirement would be greater, because you would have only a lot or two next to each other. But in the more dense zoning districts, the distance requirement would be less. So that's for the residential zoning districts. If your primary residence permitted as an accessory use, non-primary, it's permitted, but you can't be within a certain distance of another one. And then I know this was intended for the last go around, but it wasn't really written properly. But if it's not a residential zoning district, so your mixed use districts, then you can, if it's your primary residence, which we do have single family homes and duplexes in those non-residential zoning districts, because they allow them, as you saw on that orange map that I showed of all the zoning districts that allow for them. So if it's your primary residence, you can keep it as an accessory use. But if it's not your primary residence, then it can be a principal or an accessory use, and there's no distance requirement, because these are more your mixed use districts, like downtown and things like that. So districts that would allow for a hotel or a tourist home, then maybe we wouldn't require a distance in between them like we would want to for the residential zoning districts.
Thanks, Brian. And Grady, I see that you have your hand raised, so I'm going to ask you to unmute if you have a question about this section of the presentation.
And I'll say, Sven, if you want to come back to me, it's fine. I raised it just to make a comment when we get to the end of this section. So sorry, I was a little bit early on that.
Grady, you are gracious as ever. I appreciate it. And we will take you up on that. Thank you.
Okay, and then so the last go around we had, they didn't really envision these short-term rentals in multifamily dwellings. So now that we're looking at them going forward, we obviously don't want these large multifamily buildings to be taken up all by short-term rentals, mostly because it would take away from long-term renting, and also that would become more of like a hotel, not an actual residential dwelling. So what we're saying is no more, or only a third of those units for multifamily dwellings. So multifamily, 3 or more, we think of the large residential buildings, but it can also be a triplex, a quad. So what we're saying is if you have one of those, only a third of the units or a maximum of 10. So if you have a triplex, you could do one of the units. But then if you have one of like a 300 unit building, you only get up to 10 units can be short-term rentals. So that's something we're looking at for multifamily dwellings. And then these other 2 operations recommendations, these are just keeping what we already had. You can either do the entire dwelling unit or individual rooms, maximum of 5 rooms. And you can't double book if you're an operator. You can only have one transaction on the property at a time. And again, these are kind of more the administrative recommendations, keeping that short-term rental fee. You have to renew every 2 years, and then really just increasing staffing for short-term permitting and enforcement. Because what happened back in 2019 and 2020 is right now we only have 2 zoning enforcement staff who they were getting pulled in so many other directions regarding signage, illegal businesses, and this kind of got put on their plate. But we just didn't have the capacity for 2 staff members to really take full enforcement of these. So we looked at other localities, and they really have only those staff are dedicated only for short-term rental permitting and enforcement. So we know in order for this to be successful, we really have to have that staff dedicated solely for the permitting and enforcement of these short-term rentals. And really adding a fine or penalty for non-compliance, and increasing it when you get multiple violations, because right now if we had a host compliance who were helping us send out letters, but it just takes a while to go through the whole fine penalty process and bringing them to court and things like that. So really encouraging people, if they get caught, to stop doing it. And then also pretty recently, I believe in October of 2020, Airbnb is looking at collecting the local jurisdictions can collect the transient occupancy tax. So that's something we're looking at doing. And then also one of the concerns we heard was about making sure that these short-term rental spaces were actually safe for people to stay. And right now we require like a floor plan showing the fire extinguishers, the carbon monoxide, things like that. But really having someone going out to inspect the space, someone who's familiar with the building code requirements, to go out and look at that. So that's a new recommendation as well. And I think that's all I kept on there. So if we have any questions on I think Grady had one. If we had any questions, Kevin, did you have anything to add on that, or we're gonna see what the questions are?
No, I think one of the things, just maybe to clarify again, in terms of in the residential areas, the potential to allow for an STR for non-primary residents. The goal here is to prevent a proliferation of those. And so having a distance requirement between another non-primary one, that is something I think in terms of the spacing among them is yet to be discussed or considered. Obviously, in areas where homes are closer together, the distance may be a little shorter. But I can't say right now, and this is part of the feedback that we're looking for, is the spacing between them 300 feet, 3,000 feet. It's working on crafting what is the distancing requirement, or looking at taking that back out as is currently on the books right now. But I think it is important, as Brian discussed, to separate out, which our current ordinance does not, STRs that are operating in our districts versus STRs that are operating in non-residential districts, because we make no distinction right now.
Thanks, Kevin. And Anna in the chat asks a good question, which is the plan on the part of the city to grandfather existing short-term rentals which are operating now illegally? And she touches on something that obviously we hear about all the time, which is the current presence of illegally operating STRs throughout the city.
Sure. Well, we can't grandfather illegal things. It has to be operating in conformance with the law. So if it is operating without a permit right now, then it should be reported to us for us to follow up on and investigate. In terms of grandfathering, the only grandfathering that we would have is somebody who has a current STR permit under or a certificate of zoning compliance under the current ordinance. Those are set to expire. Once it expires, if a new ordinance is passed, they would have to come in compliance with the new ordinance as it's passed. So, Brian, is that every year or 2 years? I think they need to be renewed. Oh, you're
Yes,
muted.
every 2 years.
2 years. So I would say at the time, if a new ordinance is passed, and if somebody just got theirs right before, the most you would have is potentially 2 years of somebody who would be grandfathered under the old rules before he got to the new rules. But if they're operating illegally right now, that's illegal. There's no grandfathering illegal.
And in that same vein, I'm just going to surreptitiously drop in the chat the 311 request that any resident can submit for a zoning violation, including an unpermitted short-term rental, that really helps the city to identify where there are those instances. So if you're aware of them, please do make use of 311 to bring that to the city's attention. I then saw Martha's hand raised. Martha, I'm going to prompt you to unmute.
Can you hear me?
Sure can. Yep.
Great, thank you. And thank you again. I have another question, and I hope this is a silly question, but I just want to make sure that I know that I live in the Fan, and I believe that under Richmond 300, in the next zoning, when zoning gets updated, I feel like we were going to change from something to being like neighborhood mixed use or something, a different category. And I just want to make sure that we're still going to be considered a residential zoning district, even after the new zoning ordinance comes into effect.
That is, it's not a silly question. I think the neighborhood mixed use designation is a designation for future land use in terms of how the built environment will look and will operate. Within that, it can be a set of a variety of different ordinances that will can help achieve that. And I will say ones with an R designation, right, that are residential in nature have, residence as a primary use of that. I think that is something that as we work on the zoning code, we will look at very carefully because again, the majority of our city from just a physical land use space is residential. And so I think in terms of, what's being proposed right now, making sure that what it is would get transferred, if that's the policy intent, would get transferred to rewriting the ordinance so that the same policy applies. And so that common thread, I think, again, from a use perspective, if the use is primarily residential, right? And that is, I live here, I sleep here, and whether I own or rent, that's the primary purpose and function of the neighborhood. That is what is, from a health, safety perspective and welfare, is what the zoning ordinance is trying to uphold. And so we would look at that as we move forward with part of the ordinance. And there will be lots of discussions about, number one, not only like what types of categories do we have in terms of new zoning codes, but also where and how they're applied, with a lot of public engagement on that. So that will be a thread that will be discussed when we come to that time.
Okay, if I could just interject a question because it's somewhat related. So for the non-residential zoning districts where it's mixed use, et cetera, I mean, I think part of the goal of mixed use is that you have business and people living there. And so will there be, I mean, what's to prevent what's supposed to be mixed use becoming all commercial because all the, what are supposed to be apartments with people living in them become short-term rentals or overwhelmingly so? Thank you.
I believe, and Brian, correct me, as we're proposing for the non-residential zoning districts, the ratio would still apply, and that is for multifamily units. That it would still be limited to a maximum of 1/3 or 10 units. So let's say you've got the, a triplex, one of those could be an STR, you've got a 10 unit, 3 of those could be, you take the Opus, or now known as the Ascend, right? Even though there's like over 100 units, you could only have 10 of those as short-term rentals. So that would still apply across whether it's residential or non-residential. And that is so specifically that purpose of I'll say limiting the short-term nature of, wanting to provide long-term residents an opportunity to live and not having it fully convert into a short-term rental. Now, you could go down a path to ask for a special use permit for it, but as a by right, even in the non-residential zoning districts, is to prevent a large multifamily complex from becoming into more or less a hotel.
Okay, thank you. I appreciate that. And go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, Catherine. Martha, I just saw that your hand was still raised and you're unmuted. So did you feel like your question was fully addressed, or did you have any follow-up there?
Sorry, I forgot I needed to lower my hand, but I think what I'm hearing is that it is not like that I consider myself to live in a residential district, but it is not necessarily guaranteed that it'll remain so. Is that correct?
No, I think as we don't know what we don't know of what the future zoning categories will be. And I guess what I'm trying to make the connection between is that in areas that have primary residential uses with a small percentage of other uses, the goal would be to maintain the nature of those being primary residential. And that is to limit proliferation of any type of short-term rentals. And so while I could say, yes, this would be like, and maybe R6 just exists like R6 does today, but I can't prescribe that. And so until we have discussions about, what that future zoning category would look like or what it would entail, I can't say it would be one thing versus the other, but I do believe that in terms of, I think the approach that we're looking at is, to keep districts, to make them really reflect what they are in terms of, especially a lot of our historic areas, that how do we, maintain the built environment that's been created and allow for, I'll say, small incremental growth that doesn't, that allows for us to take in residents, but does so in a way that doesn't, destroy the upend the character of the neighborhood.
And for everybody's benefit, for some context to that conversation, I believe, Martha, you're asking in reference to the future land use map that was laid out in the Richmond 300 plan. And I'm going to drop that in the chat for folks that may not be familiar with it, because that ties back to, I think, some of the conversation that we're having here.
Yeah, and maybe just another way just to think of it is the future land use categories do not automatically convert into zoning categories. That is, every future land use category has separate zoning distinctions in them, which may include some that are exclusively residential, some that are exclusively commercial, and some that are a mix of both. So don't look at the future land use map and assume like that is my future zoning as well. That's a lot of nuance and conversation to be had in terms of how we make that transformation.
I appreciate what you're saying, and it sounds like you, at least what I think you're saying is that you intend for instance, and to be protected and not to be rezoned as a non-residential area, so that we would be protected from having so many short-term rentals in such a small area. However, can I just give my opinion that the non-residential zoning district portion of this proposed short-term rental, these proposed short-term rental regulations was the one part that I didn't think I had a problem with. But now knowing that it's theoretically possible that my neighborhood would be rezoned as non-residential, I have a problem with that part too. So just as one voter, that's my opinion. Thank you for answering my question, Phil.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Martha, for following up there. We have a question in the chat from John that uses a term that I love. I don't know if it's a term du jour in planning, but casual rental. Are there any provisions for casual rentals in this proposal? And John's example is renting one's home out when they are on vacation.
We haven't fully discussed, but I think I know what you mean. And that is, I've used the example of, the homeowner who maybe lists their home for like the weekend of folk festival, and then that's it. So, technically per the ordinance, if you don't have everything in place, it's in violation. But if you only did it once, and you don't ever do it again, there's a way to, and a method to look at enforcement and in terms of the health, safety, welfare. But at the end of the day, what are the trade-offs with that? I think we could look at including some of that. We haven't provided it here. I think the welfare aspect that we're looking at is somebody who is using their home for an STR on a very consistent basis, right? And 365 days a year, if it's gone for a weekend, it's a fraction of a % of a time that it's not that primary residential use. But if you're doing it 180 days, yeah, that's very different. And so that is why in terms of, the rules that apply and ensuring safety and other things, we haven't carved out that exclusion, but that can be something that we discuss in terms of going over a certain number. I think from an administrative perspective, then it starts to get into, who's counting and how are we doing it. So I'll just say overall, one of the things that we're trying to do as we go through this is work better with some of the major platforms and providers to get information from them about what is actually happening, right? So if somebody lists on a platform, Airbnb or Vrbo, primarily, we can work, and other communities have worked to get data and information about how many times is that rented, and is it one night a year, or is it 180 nights a year? And so I think getting some better information to help us with the compliance is something that we didn't do before, but we'll be working on this time around.
And then, John, I see you have your hand raised. So if you have a follow-up question on that, I'm going to prompt you to unmute.
Yeah, I was just going to say along those lines, the IRS for years has had a provision that if you rent out a property, I think it's less than 2 weeks, you don't have to report it in your income. So to me, it would seem reasonable to allow some sort of casual or, not, I get your point on a one time, but if you go on vacation for 2 weeks during the year, you always go away for Folk Fest. To use your example, it would seem like that should be, an allowable event.
I will say that be part of the fine tuning that we're doing is like, what, if any, is an appropriate threshold between just a casual and incidental use and an actual business use. So No, I appreciate that comment. And I think, Brian, that's something that we can discuss as we, move forward with this.
Yeah, I get that issue, like with signage sometimes, like a store will say, we're having a grand opening. Can I put up all these signs for the grand opening over the weekend? And I have to say, well, technically, no, it's not allowed. But if you're going to put it up on Friday and it's going to be gone by Monday, then by the time someone reports it, yeah. So that's the issue we deal with, not just with short-term rentals, but a lot of different things.
Thanks, Brian. Grady has been very patient since his initial time in. So Grady, I will prompt you to unmute as well. Or at least I thought I would, but now I'm not seeing it anymore. Oh no. Oh, here you go.
There we go. All right, we got it. All right. Thank you, Sven. Thank you, Catherine. And thank you to the whole planning department. I continue to think that this has been a pretty strong community engagement effort on y'all's part. So really appreciate all the opportunities for input and feedback. So I should mention, my name is Grady Hart. I am the president of the Rosedale Civic Association on the north side. And I've talked with a lot of neighbors, a lot of residents, local folks up here as well. And I am going to continue to push us in these meetings to be a little bit stricter with regard to short-term rentals. We have an affordable housing crisis in this city. The price that I paid for my house when I bought 3 years ago, there's no way that I could afford to buy that house now. And I know there are a lot of people who are in that same situation. We need to do what we can to make home ownership, and for that matter, rentals, available to people who want to be local long-term residents in Richmond. That has to be the priority. I understand the appeal to short-term rentals, I really do, but I think we need to acknowledge that there's a very big difference between an elderly couple who is retired and wants to build an ADU in their backyard and turn it into a short-term rental to help kind of bridge the financial gap into retirement, and a company. It's not even just individuals anymore. There are literally companies coming in and buying swaths of single-family houses, or for that matter, even in commercial properties where you have more, apartment-style buildings or condos. People are coming in and renting out, or rather, and buying them in large numbers. And to me, a distance requirement is not a strong enough deterrent on that. It's just not. We have to be stronger in making sure that we're standing up for people who want to live here locally. If we do decide that we want to remove the primary residency requirement, which I'm still not in favor of, but if we decide that we want to go that route, I think we need to, at the very least, put a very low cap on how many properties a person can buy and turn into short-term rentals. I would put it at 1 at the maximum. If you want to buy more properties than that in Richmond, I understand that there's nothing we can do to stop that, but you need to either live in them or turn them into long-term rentals so that at least longer-term residents have more affordable housing options. But more than one short-term rental, and we start really looking like a place that cares more about people living in other states than about the people who want to call Richmond home. Again, thank you guys for doing this. Truly appreciate the amount of community engagement opportunities that we've had. But really just want to strongly state that claim. We need to think about our local residents and people who want to be local residents.
Thank you so much, Grady. And I agree wholeheartedly with that. I will die on the hill that this needs to be your primary residence if you're in a residential zone. And we'll continue to follow this process and encourage everyone to. We don't want to see the same people showing up at the meetings. We need to make sure that more people know about it because it does affect everyone, up and down the topics. But I am cognizant that we have some other guests. So I think this might be a good stopping point unless Kevin, you had any final comments?
I saw one other thing in the chat. I think one of the things, maybe unanswered here is just some of the administration and enforcement pieces. I think we do need to require some more things, especially, the ability to provide contact information for a responsible party who can be reached 24 hours a day. That needs to be made available to us at the city. That needs to be posted on a short-term rental, so neighbors or anybody else can contact who's owning that property. So those will be some things, going through to talk about administration and enforcement, but after, I'll say, some policy decisions have been made and narrowed and tweaked. I think the last thing, Brian, just you want to talk about the public meetings that are coming up where we can really get
Yeah.
into some more depth on these.
Yep, absolutely. So we will be giving the full presentation of these 3 zoning changes tomorrow through Microsoft Teams at 6 o'clock. And then also next Tuesday, 6 p.m. at the main public library in the basement level there. So if you want the full presentation, you could either watch the video from yesterday or attend one of these 2 meetings. But then also right now we have a little public comment form that we post on the website. So that's where you can write your thoughts and submit it to us, or you could email me. Right now, I know we're kind of encouraging people to submit it through that comment form just so we can compile through SurveyMonkey so we can compile them all together. But if you send me an email, I can keep that as well. Or also, if you want to call me and talk to me, that's fine as well. I'm much more of a talker than a writer anyway, so I'd be happy to talk with you. So we're going to keep that comment form up through January 2nd, and then the next process will just be, once we get the feedback, drafting the actual ordinances and then going through the planning commission and city council process. But so by no means is this we're still a long way from the finish line. So there's many opportunities for feedback. So just wanted to point that out. And then my contact information is on the website as well, but we'd be happy to hear what you guys think.
Awesome. Brian, thank you so much. Kevin, thank you. And Sven, I'm going to let you kick off the next section of our agenda.
Fantastic. Yeah, Brian and Kevin, thank you again. And thanks to everybody for all the great questions. And if we missed your question, or if you want to follow up, you've got their contact information, but also please feel free to reach out to our office and we're happy to connect with staff for follow-up. And I also dropped the link in the chat for tomorrow's meeting. And if folks have any issues with joining those, which does sometimes happen, also feel free to reach out to our office and we'll help to troubleshoot that. Up next, we have some more absolute rock stars from our incredible city staff in the Department of Public Works. We have Torrance Robinson, our Deputy Director for Operations with the department, as well as Travis Bridewell, who oversees a lot of our traffic engineering program work within DPW, to give us an update on DPW's work, both in the 2nd District and in the city. So Torrance and Travis, I will turn it over to the both of you.
Thank you, Sven. Again, I'm Torrance Robinson, and I'm the Deputy Director of Operations and Maintenance for the Department of Public Works, and I'm joined by Travis Bridewell, who will come on in a little later to talk about some traffic calming concern. However, before we get to Travis, I'll just speak briefly about some highlights that operations and maintenance is doing throughout the city and definitely within the 2nd District. So we're kicking off our winter maintenance program, and anytime before winter when we're kicking it off, one of the things that we like to do in preparation is to do what we'll call a citywide cleanup. Not on a large scale, but we on more of a scale where we hit areas that are known for litter, are known for dumping sites, and within that same realm vein, we will look for debris. We will do enhanced debris collection. We will increase our what we call our nighttime basket routes, or what you notice as the trash cans that are on our street cans. We will increase collections in those areas, because we know that when people are out shopping more or out visiting some of the locations throughout the city, that the street cans get a little inundated. So we know that those areas will need enhanced service. So we do that. We will be again picking up, adding to our collections throughout the city routes, and we'll be also cleaning basins and things in preparation for the upcoming winter. One of the other things that's going on now is our LEAF program. So I do encourage everyone to take advantage of our vacuum service, which is really just where leaves are vacuumed to the curb. Leaves are raked to the curb, and you pay a minimum fee of $30 to have them vacuum. The city, DPW will throughout the city, we will be doing street cleaning, which will be going through areas as a part of this citywide cleanup. We'll be going through areas throughout the city to address some of the debris that's in our curb and gutter, and some leftover litter pickup and trash that may be with public right away. Again, those are some of the highlights that we're doing in operations and maintenance. And if there are no questions, I will hand it over to Travis to talk about some traffic calming.
Yeah, and I'll just give folks one moment here. If you do have a question, again, raise your hand and we will unmute you, or you can drop a question in the chat and we'll be happy to ask that as well. And I will note, and Torrance, I think you touched on this a little bit, but sometimes inclement weather can impact, obviously, DPW's operations across the city, and certainly in the second district. We saw that recently in the Fan neighborhood in particular, where some of the scheduled street cleaning days were impacted by rain, which inhibits their ability to do some of the street cleaning. And so a lot of those routes have been rescheduled, so they will be coming back through. And in the link that I dropped in the chat, you can actually view the updated schedule that reflects those sort of rain dates, if you're curious. And then I did see a question from Wendy regarding plans for paving Park Avenue from Monroe Park on West. So Torrance, did you want to speak to that, or do you want to kick that over to Travis?
And I could hear some of that, but is it plans for paving Park Avenue?
Yes, that's right.
No. What I'll have to do, I'll get back to you with that. I can get back to you tomorrow with by email with the specific plans for that. I don't have that information before me right now.
Okay, great. And I know that that's a question that we've gotten from a number of residents, so we're happy to follow up on that. Wendy, thanks for asking, and we'll be happy to follow up separately. And Anna, thank you for the shout out. So Travis, if you want to take it away from here.
Sure, I'm going to like to hear from our guests to see what's they have on their mind. And this thing is echoing terribly on my end anyway.
You are coming through loud and clear on my end, my friend, but I will go ahead and make sure that we are muted on our end when you're speaking, just to make sure that the audio is coming through.
Okay. I like to hear from the floor, actually.
So, and
I absolutely appreciate that. Sven, are there any comments in the chat? Otherwise, I would say something our office has absolutely been hearing about that we are, actively working on is the Kensington and Robinson area and how we can make that safer for pedestrians, and just, really tragic that we have lost 2 neighbors on that stretch. Thank you.
One thing we're having at the Safe and Healthy Streets Commission is planning to discuss this in pedestrian safety at the next meeting in January 18th at 2 p.m. the Franklin Street Library. And I'm still getting a large echo.
I apologize, Travis. You are still coming through loud and clear, at least for me. But if
okay, it's echoing on my end.
Yeah, maybe. I apologize.
Okay. Does that answer your question, Councilwoman?
Thank you. Yes. And Sven, if you want to go into a little bit more detail about what we're doing when it comes to that, but I was hoping for a little bit more fulsome answer of what the options are for, post discussion, improving that.
Well, I looked at it earlier, and the intersection does have crosswalks. It has, we backed up the no parking signs. This has been several months ago to create more sight distance at the intersection. It does have an overhead flashing hazard notification beacon. It's got the pedestrian crossing signs. I think we've done a lot over the last year or two to help improve the intersection. And actually, at the Safe and Healthy Street Commission, we really be able to hear from a lot of disciplines to discuss pedestrian safety, because there have been some fatalities in the city recently, a couple on Chamberlain, I know. So we'll be talking about some of that from our just from a well spread group, I guess, in different disciplines. Does that help?
I think that is helpful, Travis. And for context, I just removed a second Travis Bridewell from the chat, from the group. So that may have been contributing to your echo. Is that better on your end now?
Yes. Excellent.
Okay,
Thank you very much.
You had a doppelganger.
Okay.
And John, I'm going to prompt you to unmute if your question pertains to that or anything else in the traffic engineering space as well.
Thank you, Ishwan. One of my comments, and probably would have been good when Betsy was on, but it seems like within our city streets and pedestrian safety, a lot of things come back to roads that are under state control. And so you have Laburnum, you have Chamberlain, you go down south of the river, which I'm less familiar with, but there was a road where essentially when I talked with the council person down there, their liaison, well, the state controls it.
Well, I think it's
And
just,
so-
actually, that's not correct. I'm sorry. What's in the city limits, Laburnum Avenue is maintained by the city, for example. All
Yeah,
the
but when you
primary
talk about
roads
lowering speed, then why aren't the speed limits lowered?
on
Why aren't we
Laburnum Avenue,
putting
for
in?
example.
Yeah, what's taking so long in terms of putting in raised crosswalks where you've got children crossing going to school? If
Okay,
if
Laburnum Avenue-
the city has control, then we need to take a much more aggressive stance towards putting in infrastructure to save lives. I
Let me tell you a little bit
apologize,
about
but
Laburnum.
you do have people dying out there.
Can I have the floor?
Yeah, sure.
Laburnum Avenue is maintained by the city between the Henrico, within the city limits, starts in Henrico County. We feel that 35 through engineering studies is a proper speed limit for that corridor. We have recently, by council resolution, installed enhanced speed signs where you have a $200 additional fine for that corridor. We've installed many speed limit signs along the corridor from an engineering standpoint. I've shared we've done some traffic samples on Laburnum, and I've shared the peak speeding times with the police department and lieutenant there for their active enforcement of key times. And we have some projects in the area if you want to hear about that.
Yeah, I'd like to hear about them, but
Okay,
again,
There's one project we're doing is we've heard complaints over the years about the side swipe crashes and people parking on the grass right there at the school, I think between Brook and in that area. So we have a capital improvement program actually widening just a little bit so that people can park in front of their homes on Laburnum. And that's managed by the Department of Public Works. I have the project manager. I'm not sure exactly the schedule, but I can share that with you if you want.
sure.
We also, with the circle at the Laburnum and Hermitage intersection, the strategy there, once the monument and circle is removed, we're looking at getting a consultant to study that intersection thoroughly to determine the best treatment for that intersection.
Are you familiar with protected roundabouts that
Yes,
will
that
allow
was one.
pedestrian?
Yeah, there was one planned many years ago through council ordinance. It pretty much killed the roundabout at that intersection. It goes back, I think,
That was before I
2009.
moved to the city, but I'm aware of that. But again, once you remove that statue, to be looking at a protected roundabout, studies have shown that roundabouts are much more effective at calming traffic, and you have fewer pedestrian accidents than you do with streetlights.
I fully support the roundabout. I came to the city about the time it was under design, and I think it was the best treatment. However, it should be an option once our consultant looks at the intersection. However, we do have an ordinance that prohibits a roundabout at that intersection.
The council could change that. Is that not correct?
Councilwoman?
I would be happy to volunteer, John, that we would be happy to have conversations about that ordinance. Frankly, I at least was not familiar with the history there, but I think we'd like to work together with our 3rd District Council member, who also represents the north side of Laburnum there, on addressing that. I know that's something they've been tracking very closely. And the first step is to make sure that we can defeat some of the lawsuits that the city is confronting right now, to make sure that we can actually remove the statue itself and make that a much safer intersection. But and as Travis alluded to, council members Jordan and Lambert did carry legislation to implement enhanced speed penalty signage on that corridor. One of the more cost-effective measures that we do have, and that's within council's purview. And I'm also happy to share some of that information about the lane widening projects that Travis alluded to as well. And then,
Because excuse me, but I'm not as familiar with the lane widening, but if you widen lanes, traffic will go faster.
right. And I
That's a
think,
proven fact.
The sections being widened is planned for between Brook and Hermitage, and we've heard loudly from the people living along there that their cars are being sideswiped and they're parking on the grass. So that's why we.
But if you widen the lanes, traffic will go faster. I live near there and will cross it on walks on a regular basis. I do not ride my bicycle on that because it's so unsafe. But if you widen, if you widen lanes, people go faster. It's just, it's natural. You feel protected. Your car feels protected. If you go faster. If you go to MacArthur, where you have people randomly parked on both sides of the street, people go slow because they are concerned about sideswiping their cars.
yeah, agreed on that point, John. I do know that we have some other folks that have raised their hand, and I think there's opportunity for us to have more conversation about.
I have one more improvement that's planned on Laburnum. I'll share that and I'll listen. Sure. A pedestrian hybrid beacon. We have a couple in the city that's planned at Laburnum and Monticello. That's under design and should be installed next spring. It's in the works. Funded, under design, in the works for construction.
If I could say one last thing, pedestrian hybrid beacons are inherently unsafe.
Okay.
People crossing, I've personally witnessed this multiple times elsewhere. The beacon goes off, the first car stops, you're crossing across, and somebody who's impatient swerves around the car that stops and hits the pedestrian. They are not an effective tool. And they're not worth putting in. They're actually a hindrance.
We're putting in a couple, we're putting in a few more, and those are through highway safety grants. The feds.
Well, I'm not commenting on your funding and so forth. I'm just telling you reality. If you go into the studies, they are worse than not being there.
Thanks for your comment.
And I know, John, that there are a lot of other interventions that are ongoing there. There's the Safe Routes to School program that we've got some constituents who do great work volunteering and working with Colton there to help assist students crossing that intersection. There are a lot of different approaches, I think, and it's got to be kind of all hands on deck. But Travis, thank you for sharing that. And then Torrance, I saw that you had your hand raised. Is there something you wanted to add in that space as well?
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the DPW and along with the sister agencies such as the fire department, Richmond Police Department, we're taking an initiative to look at throughout the city with traffic calming and to introduce engineering solutions along with enforcement and which will also entail what Travis is doing with the community engagement. So I just want to mention that and just put out there that some of the issues that we have in the city with traffic calming, with speeding and things, they're not resolved just by engineering solutions. It takes engineering, education, and enforcement. And that's what we're looking to do with additional funding and just work collaboratively with our sister agencies.
Yeah, thank you for that, Lawrence. And we are excited to see that in a mid-year appropriation with some of the surplus dollars that have recently been certified, we have heard from the administration plans to allocate over $1 million towards some of those efforts. And that'll be coming back before council this month. So I think we're excited to see some progress on citywide interventions, assessments, and initiatives with respect to both infrastructure and enforcement. And then Randy, thank you for your patience. I saw your hand raised and you are prompted to unmute.
Travis.
Yes.
Hello.
Travis.
Travis.
Yes.
I apologize, Travis. Randy was a particularly astute Zoom bomber. Hadn't dealt with one of those in a while, but he's keeping me sharp and on my toes. I appreciate that.
I have
yeah.
some other canned discussions, but I'd rather listen to the people, go ahead.
Yeah, so Randy has been kicked from the meeting, but if folks have additional questions for Travis and Travis, if you have additional things that you want to share. Or
Yes, I do.
Lawrence,
I'd rather hear from the people, but.
Well, yep, and as soon as we see any questions pop up, we can definitely address
Okay.
those if you have any other items you want to address.
Yeah, I'll continue on then. Let me see. Scott's Addition, is this the opportunity to discuss that?
Absolutely.
Okay, back in the summertime, I think it was August or September, I presented the DPW plan for the Scott's Addition subdivision. And I met with a group of people there. I don't know if how far the information got, but we're doing a lot for Scott's Addition. We're really paying attention to that. One thing in the paving program, next spring, summer, we'll be paving. The plan is to pave every street in Scott's Addition. With that comes raised crosswalks rather, at 5 locations. I can give them if you want right now, or I can move on.
Yeah, and Travis, are those reflected anywhere on DPW sites so that I could share that in the chat as well?
And no, they're not. I gave it to the, I told the leadership there, I forget who was there. I know Addison was there from a business standpoint, I believe, but I can share that with you. And I can write email and you can put it out there.
That sounds good.
We're also planning crosswalks at every intersection in Scott's Addition. We're planning parking boundary markings, or little L markings and signs for the loading zones, time parking, and no parking at each intersection. Bike lanes, we're having 4 proposals. Jake Helmboldt's working with that program. I'm not sure where he is, because I gave my presentation last summer. I'm not sure if he's heard back from the neighborhood. Do you know?
I apologize, Travis. Could you repeat that?
The 4 proposals for bike lanes in Scott's Addition, we're considering 4 proposals. I'm not sure how far along that is. My presentation was in last summer, so.
Yeah, my understanding was that there was alignment from the public surveys and from the design proposals for the contraflow design. Is that correct?
Yes.
Great. And I dropped in the chat where people can view more information about those proposals as well.
Okay. Also, ADA ramps will be at each intersection. As far as the sidewalks go, there are several projects actually in the works. I'm not that familiar with all of them, but sections of missing sidewalks will be done. I can send you the email and it'll list all that. Let me see. It's a streetscape project that's planned at the BRT. Design starts next month. Construction plan in FY25. let me see, some parking issues through Steve Bergen and Lynn Lancaster with parking. 3-hour parking in several areas are planned. This is all coordinated with the paving program. The removal of outdated signage and loading zones. We're really looking at that hard and clean it up. Restrictions were not placed in residential areas for that. And once Steve Bergen and Lynn Lancaster, they'll reach out to the subdivision within at least 2 weeks' notice on any of their changes planned.
And
So
Travis,
that's
I
kind
just
of a
wanna
snapshot. That's not a
apologize.
snapshot of Scott's Addition.
Yeah, I just want to pause you there briefly, and Jerome, I apologize, I missed these questions initially in the chat. One was a piece of feedback about a need to redesign the corner clearance markings for where no parking indicators are placed. So Jerome, if you'd like to expand on that, I'm happy to unmute you. And then he further asked a question about whether there's an effort to do away with one-way streets in Scott's Addition. So Jerome, you should have the ability to unmute if you'd like. And if not, Travis, you mind addressing those questions?
I'll continue then. Want me to move to another neighborhood?
Do you mind addressing the question about the one-way streets in Scott's Addition?
We've looked at that. We are making some changes, yes, on that. I don't recall exactly what. I just sent you a note of the data about email, but I don't know the exact. I'd have to follow up with that, exactly what streets were changed and
Great.
what streets we are trying, depending on what the bicycle routes are decided, that will kick into the one-way, two-way thing.
Okay, gotcha. And Jerome, you should be unmuted now. I apologize about that.
I'm unmuted. Yeah, thank you. My question about the corner clearance is that Carver has quite a few corner clearance markers. I think every corner in Carver is marked, but no one understands what those markings are because they're so small. Number one, is there a way to redesign those corner clearance so that it's understandable so that people that are parking realize that you cannot park from that tick mark to the corner?
I can talk to our public affairs person to see if she can reach out and develop something. But my whole thing is I would rather have signs than the markings. The signs will last a long, long time. The markings wear out so quick. So, and the standard we use is from the Federal Manual on Uniform Traffic Control Devices. It's a standard, so we're not planning to enlarge the markings or change them. But I really am in support of signs where we need them instead of the markings to supplement. The markings will supplement the signs.
We've talked about those signs for Carver, with Steve. The only thing that we kind of said, we probably have more signs in Carver because we are a parking by permit district. Right. And then not only that, we have a lot of like the side streets, like Catherine and Norton has corner clearance signs, but from Norton and Clay, there's no corner clearance sign. There's just like a tick mark there. And I think we have both in some places, but it's just a matter, I guess, of educating the public as to what that little mark is when they get to it, to thinking that it's okay for them to park there.
Yeah, education and then also enforcement, right? To make sure that if they are parked over, that folks understand that there's a penalty associated with that. I apologize. Travis, do you know, are those signs, are you able to request those via 311?
Oh yeah, sure.
Okay, great. I'll drop that.
We prefer that anyway, unless you're tackling a whole neighborhood like Scott's Addition or something, or Carver.
I'll drop that link in the chat as well. And then John, I see your hand raised and you should be able to unmute.
One, I'm a big supporter of bike lanes, but I would say within Scott's Addition, over focusing on adding any bike lanes, I would highly recommend on focusing on any traffic calming actions that could be taken and getting the speed down, even going to having a 20-mile-per-hour speed limit within Scott's Addition. I've ridden those streets quite a bit, and if you have cars going slow, there's really not a need for bike lanes per se within Scott's Addition. It's not like you have a corridor where, take a protected bike lane on Brook Road. Very necessary, great asset for the city. But if you're just gonna paint some lines on the road, I would rather see the money spent on lowering the speed limits and traffic calming within there.
We are planning 5 raised crosswalks in Scott's Addition.
And that's
also,
great.
and marked crosswalks at every intersection, so.
You said that, and I the raised crosswalks, I applaud. I mean, I don't know if you have plans to put in more 4-way stop signs or.
I have to follow
Yeah,
the
but-
manual on uniform traffic control devices, and I don't think there's any more out there locations.
Okay.
And then Travis, to follow up on John's point about physical separation for cyclists, do you know if any of those proposed bike lanes also propose any bollards or any physical separation devices as well?
I'd have to check with Jake Helmbold. I don't know. He
Okay.
manages the program, so you know Jake, so.
Yep, sure thing. Happy to reach out. Okay,
Okay.
thanks.
Sorry.
And John, I'm happy to follow back up with you on that one as well.
You only moved to Carver?
Absolutely.
Okay. I know Jerome asked for several all-the-way stops, and I mentioned this manual on uniform traffic control devices. It has conditions where basically there's so much traffic on the free flow street and there's so much traffic on the stop street. The only one that met the conditions, the federal conditions, was Marshall and Bow Street, and we're all planning an all-way stop there. We're all planning some traffic calming in the area with a raised crosswalk on Lee at Hancock and speed tables on West Clay and West Marshall. Both of those between Hancock and Goshen or Harrison. We haven't fine-tuned it yet, but speed tables are planned for Clay and also for Marshall.
And Travis, if I recall correctly, there's also a speed table plan for Lee, correct? Or did you already address that?
This is Lee at Hancock. We're planning a raised crosswalk. Yeah.
Okay, great. Thank you.
And we actually installed some more 25 signs on the flashers near the school in the last few weeks.
Fantastic. And what I'm going to do here, and I may come to regret this, but I think we are clear of Zoom bombers at this point, having kicked out one gentleman so far. I'm going to go ahead and allow everybody the power to unmute themselves as they see fit. So again, if you have anything that you want to chime in with in terms of comments or questions, you can feel free to do so.
I have one last comment for Carver, and this applies to most anything, is a road safety audit where you can get to different disciplines such as the police department, the fire department, the school, the community involved in looking at safety, particularly around that school. So that's always an option, and I'll be able to facilitate that if interest.
I mean, that I think sounds fantastic. And Jerome, I don't know if you have any comment on that or any other residents in the area there, but I think we would be more than willing to take you up on that offer.
Just let me know.
Okay, great. Well, we will absolutely be following up on that. And again, folks, you should be able to just go ahead and unmute yourself if you have any questions for Travis or for Torrance. And thank you both for sticking with us this late in the evening, but either in the space of DPW operations or traffic safety. And again, I'm going to redrop the link for the January 18th meeting of the Safe and Healthy Streets Commission, where a lot of this will be discussed in addition to a lot of other citywide initiatives.
Yeah, I would just also thank you so much, Torrance and Travis, for coming. And just for those that brought up questions about Laburnum, that is something that Councilmember Lambert and I we're not aware of when we came into office, that project for the widening, and we are digging up the history of where it came from, and we'll be actively reaching out to Northside about this. John, I share your concern about widening not solving the underlying problem here. So that's something we, to be continued as a discussion item. I also wanted to bring up that me and other colleagues on council are working to try and get the General Assembly to allow localities to lower speed limits on local streets instead of having to install new signage everywhere we want to lower the speed limit. So some of you have already heard me talk about this, but the idea is a national initiative, 20 is plenty. So lowering the speed limit to 20 on our local streets and having that be, just a blanket speed across the city with, some supporting signage
that would be the best approach for us to lower it versus what we would have to do now is re-signage the entire city. And it would just be cost prohibitive when we would rather be spending that money on, some of these infrastructure projects. So we're hopeful that this GA, we will be able to get that change. But I just wanted to add that to the conversation. And again, thank you so much for coming. Appreciate both of you for being here.
Catherine?
Anytime.
Yeah,
Yes.
this is John. I very much appreciate your comments. I very much appreciate your comments on 20 is plenty. I would say my reading of the law is such that for it to be enforceable, you have to have a sign on that street. I don't think that that would prohibit the city from going to 20 is 20, publicizing that and putting up signage as they swap out.
Well,
Because
one
to me,
thing there,
to me, it's
I'm
as
happy to
much
have-
it's as much a statement about where our values are that as an enforcement. Getting that message out, I think, would be very important to say 20 is plenty on residential streets.
Mhm. Yes, I'm happy to continue the conversation 100%. In the interest of time, though, I think we do need to let our faithful Richmond City partners return to their evening and move on down the agenda. So if that's okay, I'd happy to continue the conversation, but I think we need to move on to the next topics. And with that in mind, we did have RPD scheduled to give an update. And, this morning I attended a funeral for one of the RPD family, and Officer Cuddy, who was on the Hope unit. Just really, really tragic that he is no longer with us. So out of respect for our colleagues at RPD, I knew that they wanted to be home with their families this evening, or their colleagues. So we're not going to have an RPD update this evening, but they will be at our next meeting. And I can, definitively say that Acting Chief Edwards is, I believe, doing a terrific job. And I know we all, appreciate him stepping up when Chief Smith stepped down. So with that, I will let Sven give some other office updates. The last thing I guess I will say is along the planning aspect, just because that was a large component of this meeting. And I know it's something that our district is, very, very keenly following. The Richmond 300 amendments that had been languishing at council, they did have enough sponsors, presumably to be voted through, but kept getting continued because there was not the confidence that once those amendments got to Planning Commission that they would be adopted. And this has a lot of legal and code backstory, but the short version is that Planning Commission does not have to adopt City Council amendments. So in the interest of trying to get these amendments out of this temporary purgatory where they're not being voted on, myself and some other colleagues have put forward the idea of having them attached to Richmond 300 as like an appendix. So rather than a formal sort of revision of Richmond 300, which is going to happen at the 5-year mark anywhere, they're going to come back and revisit, which is now, like 2 years away, basically. But the idea would be to take these amendments, some of which have already been enacted through other ordinances or resolutions or are no longer relevant, some which very much still have public support. They would become an appendix to Richmond 300 so that when that, 5-year mark gets hit, it becomes, a starting point for the discussion of looking at Richmond 300 again. And it's there in print anytime someone wants to reference the work that was put into it. So that may or may not be discussed next week. It's our belief that we might be able to discuss it next week on the agenda, but it's also possible it gets continued into January. So we will absolutely have that in our newsletter if it looks like it will be up on the agenda. And I think all things considered, it's sort of the best path forward for where we are at the moment. And then Sven, if you had any other, district topics that you want to bring forth before we start to wind down and let people get back to their evenings. I know you always have a great pulse on what people are reaching out to our office on. So I'll kick it to you. Thank you.
Sure. Appreciate it. And there are a couple of legislative items that we've been working on in conjunction with some other members on council that, we hear a lot on these issues from constituents, including urban forestry and the need for us to invest in, grow and protect our tree canopy in the city. And we're working on legislation to bring back the Urban Forestry Commission and allow residents to be able to serve on a commission that would then help to shape our urban tree policy here in the city. And Councilor Jordan already championed a staff position this year in the budget to bring on an urban forester within the Department of Public Works, who will help work with Urban Forestry Commission and effectuate our goals in our urban forestry master planning effort that we are currently underway with. So we're really excited about kind of the nexus of all three of those things to really make progress on our urban tree canopy goals, both in Richmond 300 and elsewhere. Cindy, I see that you have your hand raised, so if you want to go ahead and ask a question, you should be able to unmute.
Hi, yeah, Catherine, in relationship to what you were just speaking about with the Richmond 300 plan, that was a part of my question earlier in the meeting. There really was a strong understanding that neighborhoods would have the capability of going before planning or zoning or council or whoever to find those exceptions that needed to be considered for their particular neighborhood. And the first one, which I was aware of that came into play, that was a neighborhood requesting an exception, was Oregon Hill. And City Council, my understanding, voted unanimously to support the neighborhood. When it went to planning, they unanimously supported not going with City Council. Neighborhood associations are frantically talking as a result of that. And obviously the main question is, who's leading the city? Those we elect or those who just happen to be on staff? So my question to you is, knowing that there is a strong undercurrent on this particular topic, what are things that we can do as individuals or neighborhood associations to give your voice more power?
Thank you, Cindy. I guess I would just say continue to speak up at Planning Commission directly and reach out to those members. But then, also be aware that, I'm just gonna be frank, if it's the same people speaking every time, it starts to lose its power. So it needs to really be coming from whole neighborhoods. Things like petitions are useful sometimes. That would be my recommendation. And I know we've talked about this topic quite a bit and understand the continued frustration.
Yeah. That vote was stunning. And I listened to the Planning Commission meeting, and it was so obvious that the people were not being listened to, that the particular committee meetings were making decisions that really weren't representative of the voices that all of our city council representatives. That's what we elect you for, is to be our voice. And it was numbing to see that not happen. And it just made everybody that was there and those that have heard about that particular vote feel like the city is losing its compass. And that's very sad.
Yeah, and Cindy, if I may, I would just add to what Catherine already said, which I think is really true. Just by participating in the meeting tonight, and if folks have participated at any stage in the zoning changes engagement process that's been underway for a number of months now, or plan to in the near future, that is a huge way to have significant bearing on the future of our land use policy in the city. And there are a number of those sort of things that are coming immediately down the pike, even before we get to the amendment process for Richmond 300 in 2025, including the comprehensive rewrite of the zoning ordinance that Kevin Bonk referenced in his presentation. And a third opportunity that's pretty explicit for citizen participation is we have impaneled a charter review commission that is made up of residents of the city that really take a deep dive look at where are opportunities to realign our charter with the goals of council and of residents and modernize it and address some of the deficiencies that may be there now and may be holding us back with respect to planning commission, with respect to a lot of other these issues that we've run into. So I would say that's another one that has kind of flown under the radar that is really important for people to engage in, and I'll drop some information about that in the chat.
I think everyone left on the meeting, no one from planning is on the meeting anymore. Can I respectfully request that they be made aware of these final comments?
Yeah, absolutely.
Cindy, I'm pretty sure they know exactly how you feel and how the coalition feels. I mean, like, I will, continue to uplift it, but, I think they are aware.
Yeah, and I'll note that in the presentation from yesterday, they referenced that, there's been a huge amount of engagement, and it's a huge credit to folks on this call and a lot of others in the second and across the city, but the second in particular has been at the forefront in participation in focus groups, in the survey, in the various engagement meetings that they've had so far. And ultimately, I think it's going to come down to these proposals all have to come before council and separately. And so it's going to be at that point that the people's voice gets to be heard.
Catherine, I think the problem is that they do know how we feel, and yet that was not reflected in what they're proposing.
Are we talking about the short-term rentals now in the parking?
Yeah, I mean, we're talking about everything generally,
All
but
three.
I particularly short-term rentals, I feel like are, the meetings that I attended, the only people who in favor of getting rid of the residency requirements were the short-term rental operators, and it was pretty clear all residents did not want to require.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously very much emphatic about keeping the residency requirement, but I think there are people that live in Richmond, like putting aside the businesses, the folks who are not from here, that are trying to run STRs. There are people here who are building wealth doing that, or who are able to sustain their mortgage or whatever, like who have been very vocal about it. And maybe they're being vocal about it, like directly to planning, maybe directly to the forums, directly to council members. In addition to the folks that I think are like the usual folks that are pro STR that show up at the meetings. But I do think when you talk about the affordable housing crisis we're having, there's nothing to rent. That is the best argument for why this has got to be, residency requirement. And I think that will prevail at the end. In addition to the fact that it's just very unwieldy, what they were proposing with the distance requirements. I mean, that's so unwieldy. How would they ever, it's just too complicated. So I think they were trying, I don't know. I'm not gonna carry water for planning because I don't work in planning, right? But I think maybe they're trying to balance or show some different perspective of what they've heard. We just need to keep being loud about what we want to see in it.
Do you know to what extent they've looked at best practices for other cities on all three of these topics?
Well, of course they did. I mean, you can go to their website and they've cited all the other cities that do it. And so, yeah, I mean, I do think they have been putting a lot of energy into trying to come up with a workable solution. And the truth is there are cities that do things different ways, right? But I think what we've seen are the ones that have been late to having strict enforcements are really suffering.
Correct. Yeah, and it's almost a question of perhaps the city that its citizens envision as our future city is not at all what they are aiming for.
Well, I think
There
the
is
more
a
you make it a
disconnect.
us versus them conversation, when you're talking about planning and people who work at the city, I think the harder the collaboration is going to be. So I would just caution you from that.
No, I
tone,
understand that.
honestly.
No, but it's, it would be refreshing if we knew, so what is your vision of the city? Perhaps that's where the disconnect is, and the discussion needs to be on that level versus the weeds of enforcement of various zoning and planning and that kind of thing.
Well, I think
don't know.
we've got 10 minutes to 8.
That's a,
Are you asking me personally for my vision of the city? Or are you saying
No,
you
no,
want to
no.
hear
Just-
from the
I
planning
would
board?
love, yeah, and I did on one of the meetings, Bonk was giving an initial report to planning about how he was, his vision of moving forward that involved them. And for that to be more common knowledge, there may be some discussions on, what's the big game plan that could help understand the avenues that the people are wanting to not only hear, but be comforted by what is your idea of what will be in 15 years, 10 years, 20 years? Is that really what the citizens want?
All right, well, and
A more global question. I'm not asking you personally. My question to you was,
Yeah.
how can we help you make your voice strong? Sorry, I went down the rabbit hole.
that's okay. That's okay. Here's what I want to say. I appreciate everyone who's on this call because you're passionate about our community. And that was one of the comments. I also went to Congressman McEachin's funeral today. And that was one of the comments that really resonated with me was, you never know when it's like the last time you get to see someone and thank them for what they're doing. And time is short. We need to appreciate each other. So I just want to truly thank everyone here who, is spending their night talking about zoning. I really value you. What you can do to help me is try and use that passion to get other people interested in it too. To help share how it applies to them. Maybe they don't see it. I know I didn't follow city politics until I was a lot older. Talking it up at your church or, whatever your area of influence might be. I think that is incredibly helpful. So I would say at this moment, it would be that and helping push out the information so that folks are paying attention when it really matters, because the input now is when it's going to have the most effect. And I can't see the chat. Sven, were there other comments in the chat that we need to get to before we sign off?
And I think Anna was sharing
For
kind
tonight.
of some of her experience with non-permitted short-term rentals. And just kind of how pervasive it is. And if you want to speak to that as well, verbally, absolutely feel free. But I
Well,
think,
yeah, I know. I heard this brought up in the meeting yesterday, and yeah, it's ridiculous. It's out of control and it's super frustrating. So yeah, my hope is that the new regulations will be something that are actually enforced, because right now what we have is not being enforced.
yeah, I think we can all agree on that. And do you want to say anything additionally to that? I couldn't have said it better than how Catherine said it. Thank you all for bearing with us and for engaging in a lot of diverse topics. I'll talk to anybody on this call about zoning at any time of night. You guys give me a call, but I know you guys are all in it for the right reasons, and we so appreciate that we get to work with you guys every day. This will be recorded for any friends and family that you want to bring into that conversation that missed it, all 2 hours of it. So I'll be sending out that link in our newsletter on Friday. And if folks, again, had any questions that they couldn't address either with us or with staff who are no longer here, just feel free to follow up offline and we'll see what we can do. This will be our last meeting of the year. So definitely happy holidays to everybody. And I do think that you'll be hearing from the 2nd District in survey form again. I know everyone gets excited for another city survey, but asking folks, how we can communicate and engage and collaborate even better going into 2023. So stay on the lookout for that. And Catherine, did you have anything else you want to share?
No, I would just, thank you. And it's been a long day. I'm just gonna say it's been a long day, and I hope everyone is taking care of their own mental health at this time. The holidays are wonderful. They're so fun and festive, but it's not that way for everyone. So I think this was one of the common things we said at the very beginning when we were still really in COVID. Just please look out for your neighbors and for yourself, and practice grace with everyone. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you, Sven. So glad you're back. And have a good evening, everyone. Good night.
Thanks.
Thank
Hey.
Spending your time with us.